I don't know how to start this. We're just going to have a conversation. So, a lot of people think that we need to have laws against hate speech. And the number of those people have been growing in recent times. But not only that, it's become a more mainstream pushed idea that we need to lock up people for hate speech and make it a crime to engage in hate speech. And while I'm not going to sit here and say that hate speech doesn't exist and there's absolutely nothing wrong with anything anyone can say that would deserve being criminally prosecuted, there are things that are protected by freedom of speech in America, and there are a few things that aren't. Where the United States draws the line is simply if you threaten someone with a credible threat, if you incite someone to violence or to commit a crime, if you libel or slander someone, you can be sued. And there might be one or two other instances where real world injury would result from your speech. And that's where we draw the line. And we do that because we value freedom of speech far above the risk of offending someone. But why do we do that? Why do we value freedom of speech so highly? Well, it's quite simple. To pursue truth. And how can you pursue truth without asking questions? Even if those questions may be offensive to some, you have to risk offending people in order to pursue the truth. For example, a good reporter or journalist, they go out, they ask questions. They question, what is this government body doing with this money that is set aside to help these people? What are they doing with that? Oh, well, maybe by asking those questions that the government wouldn't really like to be asked, because turns out that money's not actually going to them. It's going into the pockets of these other people. And so the government definitely doesn't want people asking, where's this money going exactly? But because the journalist has the ability to do so under the protection of freedom of speech, they can find out, hey, there's government corruption going on here. And then they can tell everyone about the government corruption. And so as a tool for fighting corruption and evil in the world, and for finding truth, we have freedom of speech. And the reason why we cannot sustain freedom of speech and allow for the creation of hate speech laws is very simple. It is the question, who defines hate speech? Or who defines hate? Where is the line between hate speech and speech that you hate? That's a common way to phrase it. Because I think probably everyone can agree that someone out in the streets spouting racial slurs saying how everyone of this race is lesser or beneath them could very easily be categorized as hate speech. And you would be hard-pressed to find a way where that would not be hate speech. However, on the opposite end of the spectrum of that is speech that someone would hate to hear. Something that maybe would invalidate someone's ideas and therefore cause them mental harm. So some people would call out that by them merely just saying that there are two sexes, there are people who would define that as hate speech. Meanwhile, that issue in society has not been clearly fought. That is a war that is still going on. Battles are being waged in the United States this very day between if there are two sexes, or if there are two genders, or if there are infinite genders and sex and gender are the same, or if they're different. And in order to merely ask the question, you have to risk offending someone. So merely saying something that could be perceived as offensive or taken as offensive doesn't mean that something is hate speech. However, there are plenty of people who would love to define something that might just merely offend them as hate speech, because to them, merely asking the question is perceived as something hateful. So where would we draw the line exactly? Well, does it go to just racial slurs? If someone speaks a slur, then does that constitute hate speech? Well, here's another problem with hate speech laws, is that they might oppress or injure the very people that they were written to protect. For example, if you merely write into law that anyone who uses a racial slur shall be jailed for 30 days, given whatever fine, do you have any idea how many rappers alone would be thrown in jail, and then for repeated offenses, thrown into prison potentially? And then when you expand that to the greater population, I mean, would you count ginger as a slur? Would you count cis as a slur, as some people try and say? Would you count soulless ginger as a slur, from the joke that redheads have no soul? Would you count the retelling of an injustice? Or would you count the retelling of an experience that uses the racial slur? Would you count that under hate speech? And if you think, well, we'll just figure it out as we go. No, the devil is in the details. You need to define all of this stuff beforehand before you start throwing people in prison. So how would you define it? Where would you draw the line? Another argument against it is that hate is merely a natural emotion in human nature, and that if we are going to have a free society where you have the freedom of expression, you need to be able to express any hate that you have. Does hate speech also constitute hate against corporations, governments, organizations, individuals outside of something other than race, sex, their clothing? If you say, man, I hate those pink shoes, is that now hate speech? Because you're saying that you hate those. You are clearly and undoubtedly expressing hate. You even use the word hate in your speech. How is that not then therefore hate speech? It might really hurt that person's feelings because they love those pink shoes. Maybe they got those pink shoes from their grandmother who passed away like 2 weeks ago, and that causes them extreme mental distress. If you want to have a society where people can speak their minds, where people can pursue truth, you must allow for the risk of offending people. And if you think that it might not be worth it, well, then just look at history. Look at when different organizations and places have jailed people for their speech. They come back and they lead a movement often of hate because the jailing of them turned them into a martyr, and it amplifies their voice. It's similar to that concept of the more you try and hide and deny something on the internet, the bigger the story gets and the more people know about it. It's been a while since I've heard it, but it goes something like that. It's basically something comes out and someone is like, oh no, not at all, and they try and deny it and keep talking like, no, like that's not a thing, like, no, that didn't happen, no, and they just keep trying to deny it over and over again, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if the suppression of hate speech merely turns people into martyrs and makes hate speech proliferate, makes it spread, makes it grow, makes the message grow, then how do you properly discard hate speech from people's minds? Well, it's quite simple. If someone uses freedom of speech to express hate speech, all it takes is someone else to use their freedom of speech to disprove or to ridicule the other person's hate speech as something silly or stupid, or something like, how could you think of that? Or maybe they go, all right, well, if that's supposedly true, then let's actually ask science those questions. And then they make some experiments and they go through, and science will either prove or disprove those claims. Now, with scientific claims being proven or disproven, there is the claim itself, and then the claim of causality, or the claim about what causes such a phenomenon. And there's a difference between phenomenon A being the result of phenomenon B and phenomenon A being the result of phenomenon C. For example, if I'm in a completely empty room and I have a ball in my hand and I drop it and the camera recording picks up the rate of acceleration as 2 times the rate of Earth's gravity, well, there are a few different reasons that could be. Maybe I'm on another planet where gravity is twice as strong, and that's phenomenon B. Or maybe phenomenon A, the 2 times gravity acceleration of the ball, is a result of phenomenon C, which is maybe the room is actually being accelerated upwards into the air along with the camera, so that from within the room everything looks stable, but from outside the room you see it shooting up, and therefore it appears that the ball is dropping at twice the acceleration of Earth's gravity, when in actuality it's falling completely standard. An observed phenomenon does not always have the cause that you might think it does. I'm guessing that very rarely has science ever gotten it right on the first try, and that's why we have the scientific method, so that you can try something, try it again, try it again, try it again, and if you can't replicate it, then there's something else going on, and you really don't know what you're talking about yet, and therefore can't draw conclusions. But I digress with the whole science stuff, because really you don't even need it in order to reduce hate speech. All you have to do is allow the proliferation of I guess you would call it love speech. Things like, everyone is equal, treat others with respect. Phrases and sayings that encourage the extending of a hand rather than the extending of a finger. It reminds me of the story of a black man infiltrating the KKK. And I think he actually became good friends with, was it the Grandmaster? What was it? Here we go. How one man convinced 200 Ku Klux Klan members to give up their robes. Daryl Davis is a blues musician, but he also has what some might call an interesting hobby. For the past 30 years, Davis, a black man, has spent time befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. He says once the friendship blossoms, the Klansmen realize that their hate may be misguided. Since Davis started talking with these members, he says 200 Klansmen have given up their robes. When that happens, Davis collects the robes and keeps them in his home as a reminder of the dent he has made in racism by simply sitting down and having dinner with people. Interview highlights on the first time he befriended a member of the Ku Klux Klan. I was playing music. It was my first time playing in this particular bar called the Silver Dollar Lounge, and this white gentleman approached me and he says, "I really enjoy you all's music." I thanked him, shook his hand, and he says, "This is the first time I ever heard a black man play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis." I was kind of surprised that he did not know the origin of that kind of music, and I said, "Well, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis learned how to play that kind of style?" He's like, "Well, I don't know." I said, "He learned it from the same place I did. Black blues and boogie-woogie piano players. That's what that rockabilly rock and roll style came from." He said, "Oh no, Jerry Lee invented that. I never heard no black man except for you play like that." So I'm thinking this guy has never heard Fats Domino or Lil Richard, and he says, "This is the first time I ever sat down and had a drink with a black man." Well, now I'm getting curious. I'm trying to figure out now, how is it that in my 25 years on the face of this earth that I have sat down literally with thousands of white people, had a beverage, a meal, a conversation, or anybody else, and this guy is 15 to 20 years older than me, and he's never sat down with a black guy before and had a drink. I said, "How is that? Why?" At first he didn't answer me, and he had a friend sitting next to him, and he elbowed him and said, "Tell him, tell him, tell him." And he finally said, "I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan." On his reaction on hearing he was talking to a member of the Klan, I just burst out laughing because I really did not believe him. I thought he was pulling my leg. As I was laughing, he pulled out his wallet, flipped through his credit cards and pictures, and produced his Klan's card and handed it to me. Immediately, I stopped laughing. I recognized the logo on there and Klan symbol, and I realized this was for real. This guy wasn't joking. And now I'm wondering, why am I sitting by a Klansman? But he was very friendly. It was the music that brought us together. He wanted me to call him and let him know any time I was to return to this bar with this band. The fact that a Klansman and black person could sit down at the same table and enjoy the same music, that was a seed planted. So what do you do when you plant a seed? You nourish it. That was the impetus for me to write a book. I decided to go around the country and sit down with Klan leaders and Klan members to find out, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? On what he says to a Klansman. The best thing you do is you study up on the subject as much as you can. I went in armed, not with a weapon, but with knowledge. I knew as much about the Klan, if not more, than many of the Klan people that I interviewed. When they see that you know about their organization, their belief system, they respect you. Whether they like you or not, they respect the fact that you've done your homework. Just like any good salesman, you want a return visit, and they'd recognize that I'd done my homework, which allowed me to come back again. That began to chip away at their ideology, because when two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. If you spend 5 minutes with your worst enemy, it doesn't have to be about race, it could be about anything. You will find that you both have something in common. As you build upon those commonalities, you're forming a relationship, and as you build about that relationship, you're forming a friendship. That's what would happen. I didn't convert anybody. They saw the light and converted themselves. On what the Klansman thought when he asked them why they hated him. Initially, they feel that if you're not white, you are inferior. They believe that black people have smaller brains, or incapable of higher achievement. I'll give you an example of one. This guy was an exalted cyclops sitting in my car, in my passenger seat. He made the statement, which I had heard before, "Well, we all know that all black people have within them a gene that makes them violent." I turned to him, and I'm driving, and I said, Wait a minute. I'm as black as anybody you've ever seen. I've never done a carjacking or a drive-by. How do you explain that? He didn't even pause to think about it. He said, your gene is latent. It hasn't come out yet. So how do you argue with somebody who's that far out in left field? I was dumbfounded. I'm just driving along. He's sitting over here all smug and secure like, see, you have no response. And I thought about it for a minute. Then I used his point of reference. I said, well, we all know that all white people have a gene within them that makes them a serial killer. He says, what do you mean? And I said, well, name 3 black serial killers. He thought about it. He could not do it. I said, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, all whites. I said, son, you are a serial killer. He says, Daryl, I've never killed anybody. I said, your gene is latent. It hasn't come out yet. He goes, well, that's stupid. I said, well, duh. Yes, but you know what? You're right. What I said was stupid, but no more stupid than what you said to me. Then he got very, very quiet and changed the subject. 5 months later, based on that conversation, he left the Klan. His robe was the first robe I ever got. And that is an excellent example of how the way that you get rid of hate speech from within someone and hateful ideologies is to use your free speech to engage with that person verbally and have a conversation. Think about it like this. If there had been hate speech laws, this guy wouldn't have cared. He still would have believed whatever he had been believing before the hate speech laws came into effect. And he would have, with someone sitting right next to him who has no hate in their heart, he would have said, well, we all know that black people have within them a gene that makes them violent. But if a good person who doesn't want to risk violating the law was sitting there, they would have an incentive to not even respond using his perspective. Because for someone to say, well, we all know that all white people have a gene within them that makes them a serial killer, that would also be classified as hate speech. And that Klans member could have then reported that black guy for hate speech. And imagine if it wasn't a Klans member. Imagine if it was an Asian person who just happened to be a racist. And the Asian person said, well, we all know that all black people have within them a gene that makes them violent. That law-abiding citizen would have then had to say something like, well, we all know that all Asian people have a gene within them that makes them whatever negative thing you want to find about some small subset of Asian people. And instead of trying to face them head on, what this guy did and what someone would have to do is move around to their side and show them how stupid their logic is, merely by swapping out a couple of the words so that it's the same exact equation of logic, but just shining its light over on something else that's equivalent, and maybe shining the light back onto that person. But if you can't get through here, then you have to think more creatively and not just try and attack it directly. You have to come at it from a different angle. And if they got like walls all around that front so that no one can attack them, you get right up beside them and you go, hey, you know what? Yeah, you're totally right, because look at this. When clearly you don't believe that, but you're saying it as if you believe it. And what would distinguish someone saying it who believes it and someone saying it as if they would believe it? Would you jail that person who didn't actually believe what they said? Another great example of that specifically, for people saying things that they don't actually believe, is stand-up comedians. Are we now going to have to ban certain subjects from stand-up comedy? If someone's going to become a stand-up comic about their upbringing, is it now hate speech if that person wasn't white and they start talking about all of the non-whites around them? We can go from black to Asian. We can go to Indian. If an Indian comic is talking about how what in their culture is perceived as a good way to raise your children, but in the United States or in Britain or whatever, or in the Western world, it's perceived as illegal, is that then going to be prosecuted as someone saying that, oh, all Indian people are committing these atrocious crimes? Is that how they're going to spin it? Because they said that what they do is considered illegal in this country? Is that now going to be taken as some serious form of hate speech? That's why I can never get behind a hate speech law. And that's why I highly, highly encourage you to really think about if it would do more good or more harm. Because from everything I've seen, it would only do more harm. From turning people into martyrs to ending conversations that could actually end the hate inside someone. Hate speech laws wouldn't be even a win-lose. It would be a lose-lose, because people wouldn't want to risk saying something that might be interpreted as hate speech, and so they wouldn't creatively rebut people's hateful ideas and prove to others, if they're in a setting with other people, that that person's way of thinking is stupid and wrong. And here's why. The reason we can't have a truly free society and have hate speech laws is because it would shackle so many freedoms and only cause more harm. But I'm going to leave you with that, and please really think about that. And as always, if you enjoyed, please like this video, comment, subscribe, and peace.